What's up guys, Zell here, and welcome to my guide to the fourth circle of the Pandaemonium raids. I'll be splitting up the fight into two parts, and this video will be about the door boss, Hesperos. While mechanically this fight isn't super complex, it does boast the tightest DPS check out of all the fights in the tier. The burst windows come up at incredibly awkward moments, making it a challenge to eke out as much DPS as possible. During week 1, our group had a tough time hitting the DPS check if a single person died, and even damage downs could jeopardize a run. Many classes have received buffs since then, and depending on how much gear you go into this fight, you may have quite a bit more breathing room. This fight also has a ton of different ways to solve the various mechanics, and I'll be going over the strategies I like most. Alright, let's first start with the prep. These are the markers my group uses. You'll want to make spread spots for the tank healer group and the DPS group for Tethers. You'll also want to make light parties for healer stacks. Decide which stack will go towards the center. In my group, we have group 1 go towards the center. You'll also want to make spread spots for the whole party as well, which will look something like this. And finally, you'll want to have orb clock positions. These positions will vary depending on the strategy you use for a later mechanic called baloney bursts. For the strategy I will outline, it should look something like this. That's it for the prep, so let's start talking about the fight. Hesperos will start things off with Decolation, a hefty raid wide. Then, right after that, we'll begin the first major mechanic of the fight. The next set of casts are all comboed together and resolve at the end of it all, so I'll first explain what the casts do. There's some RP involved here, so stick with me. Blood Rake will be cast first, and tethered to either tanks and healers or all the DPS. This cast represents Hesperos absorbing the player's ether. Remember which group did not get hit by the Blood Rake. He will then cast Etheric Chlamys, which then funnels said ether into his Chlamys, which I looked up in a dictionary, and it's a cape worn in ancient Greece. Hesperos will then cast another Blood Rake targeting tanks and healers or all the DPS. This is fully random, so don't assume that because one group got hit the first time that it'll always be the second group. Again, remember which group did not get hit by this Blood Rake as well. This time he will cast Director's Baloney. I guess this translates to Director's Needle or something. Anyways, this cast poisons the stolen ether and will weaken those players to a future debuff. At the end of the Director Baloney's cast, 2 DPS, a tank, and a healer will get a debuff called Roll Call. These debuffs must be passed to the people who did not get hit by the second Blood Rake since their ether was not poisoned. Once a Roll Call is passed on, however, they will get a miscast debuff which prevents them from getting Roll Call again. Then Hesperos will cast Inversive Chlamys, which poisons the ether that his cape had absorbed, and also put out tethers on 4 random players. Players that did not get hit by the first set of Blood Rakes must take these tethers as their ether was not poisoned by the cape. At the end of the Inversive Chlamys cast, anyone who improperly took a debuff or a tether will instantly die. I know the explanation was a bit funky with the whole ether and Chlamys and baloney, but the resolution of the mechanic is much more straightforward. Essentially, when the first Blood Rake goes out, the group that did not get hit will eventually need tethers. When the second Blood Rake goes out, the group that did not get hit will need the debuffs. The debuffs come up first, so have the group that got hit by the Blood Rake stack. We have tanks and healers stack north if they got hit, and the DPS stack south if they got hit. This way, for the players who actually need the debuff, they can just walk into the stack of players and automatically be passed a debuff. The only thing you have to be careful of is making sure that only one person who needs the debuff goes into the stack at a time. If multiple players enter the stack at the same time, it's possible they might accidentally pass their needed debuff to another player, causing them to be miscast and die later. As soon as all the players who needed debuffs get them, have players who got hit by the first Blood Rake stack in the same way as before. Then the players who need the tethers should walk in between the boss and the stacked players. Wait until all tethers are properly taken, and then move out according to your spread spots. If you walk out early, there's a chance that a tether can snap backwards and leave you without a tether, causing some last minute panic and killing a bunch of people. If all goes well, everyone will survive the Inversive Chlamys cast, and Hesperos will immediately begin casting Decolation. Healers need to pump healing here so that the tethered players don't die from the raid wide. This will be followed up by Elegant Evisceration, which is a 2-part tank buster that leaves a magic vulnerability up debuff. You can choose to tank swap or simply use a tank invulnerability cooldown. Next, Hesperos will cast Setting the Scene, causing the arena to be separated into 4 quadrants, each with their own element. This brings us to the second major mechanic of the fight. To explain Pinax, we first need to talk about what each of the squares do. When channeled, each square has a unique effect and causes the tile to be unsafe. Also, quick note, the center hole of each tile also deals damage, so avoid accidentally walking into it. The lightning square is a proximity AoE from the center and will kill players who are not out at the edge. Tanks can live while being a further bit away from the wall, but there isn't a huge benefit to it. The water square is a knockback that starts from the center of the arena. The knockback is pretty massive, and if you aren't close to the center or use a knockback mitigation, you'll go flying into the wall and die. The acid square spawns individual AoEs onto each player. Overlapping these will kill both players. The fire square puts down a AoE on each healer, which needs to be stacked with at least 2 other players. Getting hit by both AoEs will instantly kill you. For Pinax, there will always be an order to how the tiles are channeled. The first square to be channeled will always be lightning or water, and then be followed up by either acid or fire. Then later on, it will always be the opposite squares that will be channeled. In between each set, Hesperos will also cast a Cardinal Shift, and either his cape or sword will glow. The cast name will tell you where the cape or sword AoE will come from. If the cape is being channeled, it will be a knockback, and if the sword is channeled, it will be a wide conal cleave. Essentially, there's a bunch of variations of Pinax, and it will take time to get used to each configuration. On top of that, this also aligns with your 2-minute burst, which can get very messy. It can be a good idea to delay burst by 30 seconds to make it easier to align everything. For Pinax, I recommend using the Uptime Pinax strategy. Not only does the strategy give you better uptime throughout Pinax, but it also circumvents some of the most cursed patterns that can happen within Pinax. So, how does this work? To start off, the main tank will need to pull the boss as far as possible to the wall in between the lightning and fire tiles. If you have a paladin, it can be a good idea to have the main tank during this section, as they lose the least by using ranged GCDs to move the boss. If the lightning goes off first, the party can stack near the edge and still get uptime on the boss. Remember to not stand in the lightning square. If it's water first, you'll want to check if the second channeled square is acid or fire. If it's acid, try to position yourself to be knocked back towards your spread spot. If it's fire, you'll want to simply knock back towards the boss. If the second channel is acid, make sure to book it towards your spread spot. There's very little time here, and the melee spots can be pretty tight. Ranged players can pre-position a little bit as the lightning goes off, although watch out from leaving too early and missing potential raid buffs. If the second channel is fire, have Group 1 immediately run towards the center while Group 2 can chill on the edge. Remember to not be on the fire square when it goes off. After this first set of elemental squares, Hesperos will teleport to the center and start casting a Cardinal Shift. Quickly identify which cardinal the shift is referring to and see if his cape or his sword is glowing. At the same time, the next set of tiles will start being channeled. Remember that this set will always be the other set of tiles that will be channeled first. Depending on the combination of mechanics, you'll have to adjust accordingly. Depending on your preference, you can time your knockback mitigation to cover both the cape knockback and the water tile. Or simply get knocked back from the water tile and then press your knockback mitigation to prevent the cape knockback only. I found for melee that it's nice to use my knockback mitigation on the cape knockback. That said, casters might prefer trying to surecast both knockbacks in order to have more control over positioning and not have casts interrupted. If all goes well, the boss will cast Elegant Evisceration, tank swap, or use your tank invulnerability. Hesperos will cast Blood Rake, however this time it will tether to all players and all squares except one. Make sure to keep in mind which square was untethered, as it will be important as a safe spot in a later mechanic. Hesperos will cast Setting the Scene again, putting the elemental tiles back on the ground. This will bring us to the next major mechanic, which I call Roll Orbs. This mechanic has many different solutions, and my group went through a bunch of iterations and landed on the Uptime Orbs, which I also think is the simplest strategy to use. There is a drawback, but I'll get into that later. Hesperos will start this section by casting Vengeful Baloney. Each player will be assigned a new role through a debuff. Tanks and healers will become DPS, and DPS will be divided into 2 tanks and 2 healers. After this, he will also cast Elemental Baloney, which gives everyone an Elemental Resist Down debuff. Then Hesperos will cast another Blood Rake, hitting the entire party with raid-wide damage. Finally, Hesperos will cast Baloney Burst. Each Cardinal and Intercardinal will spawn an orb that tethers to the nearest player and gives itself the anti of their role. This is where things get tricky with all the roles being swapped around. There are a couple rules to how Baloney Burst works. Each player will take a Thrice Come Ruin debuff every time you are hit by an orb. This means if you are hit more than twice, you will get the Doom debuff and die. Players must also share orb damage, as taking one by yourself will most likely kill you. To actually resolve the mechanic, players must identify the proper orbs to take, or, at the end of the mechanic, their entire role will be punished and die. To avoid this, you want DPS players who are the acting tanks to pop the tank orbs, the DPS acting healers to pop healing orbs, and you want the tanks and healers to pop the DPS orbs. Again, there's a bunch of ways to set this up, but the method my group uses looks like this. We have players on set cardinals and inner cardinals for when the orbs spawn and tethers to the group. Then we have pre-assigned pairs stand on their designated markers and pop the two orbs next to them. Because of the arrangement, the orb explosions will always be shared and pop onto the proper roll. This also reduces unnecessary movement, as people can just park on their marker after receiving their orb and no one ever has to adjust for how the rolls were assigned by Hesperos. The only downside to this method is that it requires hefty mitigation and shields, because orbs will be popped very quickly in succession. Other methods like cross orbs gives a little bit of breathing room between orbs to heal up, however it requires much more movement across the whole team, and DPS will need to adjust their clock spot based off of what roles were assigned. Not only that, it is way easier for people to get clipped by other people's orbs with all the running around. If the entire party is minimum item level, the uptime method might be a little dicey, but it does reduce the complexity of the mechanic. Be sure to plan your mitigation and minimally have 40% worth of mitigations and shields to survive 2 hits without healing in between. Less mitigation is necessary for higher item levels. Right after this, Hesperos will cast Periaktoi. Remember the elemental square that wasn't tethered before? That will be the safe spot. Standing in any other square will instantly kill you. The stage will be reset and Hesperos will cast another Blood Rake. Next is another combo mechanic that follows the same rules as the first set of mechanics of the fight with debuffs and tethers. However, instead of using Blood Rake to denote who needs mechanics, it will be towers. Hesperos will cast Baloney Coils, which will spawn 4 towers with anti-rolls and tethers. The anti-roll towers must each have a player in them, and the other group must take the tethers and separate them out. Unfortunately, using the same strategy from the beginning doesn't quite work as cleanly. So instead, this time we will pre-pull Hesperos into a cardinal. Then have everyone position themselves south of the boss as tethers go out. Once the towers spawn and the group has recognized who needs tethers, the group that needs tethers only needs to step towards Hesperos to pick up tethers and then separate them across the wall. This frees the rest of the group to go into their towers without crossing paths with the tethered players. In this version of role-playing with Hesperos, the players who take the tethers will need tethers later on. Hesperos will then cast Etheric Calamus just like in the beginning, poisoning the absorbed ether. Then he will cast Blood Rake, dealing damage to everyone. Then another set of towers will spawn as he casts Baloney Coils. This one is much simpler as there are no tethers to take. If you are not in these towers, you will need to pick up debuffs later. This is a good time for the main tank to pull Hesperos back into the center. Then the boss will cast Director's Baloney. These can be resolved exactly the same way as the first time. This will then be followed up by Decolation. And then another elegant Evisceration. After this, we get another Setting the Scene cast, and the arena will again be split into 4 elemental tiles. This will be the last major mechanic, and it's a repeat of Pinax. Resolve this in the exact same way as before. As Pinax resolves, Hesperos will cast back-to-back Decolation 3 times. If you get Hesperos down to 49% before 7 minutes and 12 seconds, you will have cleared the fight and moved past the door boss. This takes roughly about 48.2k DPS from the entire party. While there aren't that many mechanics in the fight, Pinax is a big hurdle in coordinating bursts for optimal DPS, and the first couple of Pinaxes will be challenging to keep everyone's head on straight. If this guide was helpful, please comment, like, subscribe, all the things, and please look forward to my P4S Part 2 guide. Thanks for watching, guys.